Good morning. Today is September 23rd, 2024, and we're going to be talking about the financing contingency and low appraisals. So for the purpose of today, I will be referencing Form 22A as well as Form 22AN. In our class today, I would like to talk about why we use the forms that we use and the consequences of using them. Do we even have to use them? And how can we leverage these forms to protect or help our buyer or seller? Then at the end, we'll discuss different situations and how it relates to the form in our real life transactions. So first and foremost, this is the financing contingency. It's a 3-page document packed full of very important and very, various types of contingencies. Within the financing contingency, we have protections for the approval of financing, as well as the protection of an appraisal. So if you see this in the purchase and sale agreement, this is one of the most important forms that we will be working with. Now, the financing contingency is an addendum, and it is a promise for the buyer to make application for the loan that they've identified with the down payment that they've noted in the time that they have promised. Now, for a buyer's good faith effort, their earnest money is going to be protected if that application fails or results in the closing not happening. So I wanted to talk about the use of the financing addendum versus the evidence of funds. One of these items is a disclosure, and the other one is a contingency protection. When we are talking about using the financing contingency, it creates a layer of protection for the buyer in the use of that contingency. Now, if we were to just use an evidence of funds, that's a disclosure of where the money is coming from for the purchase. Because if you remember on our purchase and sale agreement, in our boilerplate language, it does say all contracts assume all money is being paid in cash and non-contingent unless otherwise disclosed. So if you are not disclosing loan funds on a 22EF, you should be disclosing them on the financing contingency. Now make sure that you're not disclosing them on both places, because remember again, one of them creates a protection for the buyer, the other one does not. So do not use these forms together to disclose the same funds, or you will be using conflicting forms. Oops, that's not the slide we need to be on. Okay. So how do we fill it out? Well, looking at the financing contingency. Now, this one is the one that does create the protection for the buyer and gives the buyer an opportunity to apply for the financing as they've promised. Paragraph 1 shows the loan type and the down payment that the buyer intends to use. You should select from one of these options. If you select more than one of these options, the buyer only has to make application for one of the selections, not all of the selections. In the percentage down, that's going to be the buyer's down payment. Now remember, the buyer cannot change the loan type at all after filling this out and mutual acceptance being reached. So buyers, if you are making a loan application, please make sure that you are matching up your loan application type with this first paragraph. You may risk the waiver of this contingency protection if you don't match those up. Now, all of this loan application needs to be done within the first 5 days by default. If after those 5 days anything is changed, it does require the consent of the seller in order to do so if the buyer still intends to keep the protection of this contingency. So keep in mind that also means we cannot change the loan type or the down payment. If you put conventional first and your buyer is doing a minimal, your buyer wants to put down $100,000 instead of the minimum, and they get their approval based on the minimum, then they're not doing what this contract said they should do. So everything needs to match. Now, there are ways that this contingency can be waived. So how can a buyer retain the protection of the 22A? Well, they retain it and they keep that protection by applying for financing, agreed with the proper down payment and the loan type. Then being denied for the financing type they applied for while providing all documentation. They also need to make sure that they have the lender provide a letter that proves the requirements were met to make this loan application and show good faith and timely application. So with those protections in place, knowing the buyer has the safety net of this form, how do we waive that? How does it get taken away in that safety net? Well, the way the buyer can have this financing addendum waived, so there are no longer protections, are to just flat out do a waiver with Form 22AR. Now, in your financing contingency, you will see that the seller may have an option to ask the buyer to waive this protection. It's up to the seller to go ahead and deliver notice unless the box is checked for an automatic waiver. So the waiver of 22AR is something that the seller has to create an action for. An automatic waiver of 22A in paragraph 2B is another way it can be waived. There can be a waiver due to the breach of paragraph 1A. This would mean that they changed financing without consent or they changed their loan type at all. There could be a waiver of an appraisal with 22AN. So the appraisal provision that's in here, we could have everything waived, and there's still a way that the appraisal waiver can be done. And then changing lenders, of course, without the consent. So now referencing back to paragraph 2, 2A says the seller's notice to perform. This is the paragraph that initiates a seller action in order to remove the protection for the financing. So if box 2A is checked, or if neither is checked, it will default to box 2A. Then the seller, at a default of 21 days, can send a notice asking the buyer to remove this protection from their contingencies. Now, note paragraph 2A III, appraisal less than sales price. If that box is either left blank or checked will not, then whether that buyer decides to waive the financing contingency or not, they will keep the appraisal provision. So if that appraisal comes in low, they're still protected for that appraised value. Box 2B is going to be an automatic waiver. This means the seller is not required to do any action, and after the specified days, the financing contingency protection will be removed. It also does have an appraisal less than value or less than sales price. So even if this is waived, it's possible that there could still remain the protection of that appraisal coming in. Financing contingencies are not the same as appraisal contingencies. So that's why I said this form holds essentially two contingencies in it, one for the approval for finance and one for the appraised value to come in. As I said before, check box 2A or 2BII to make sure your buyer has that protection of that appraisal. Paragraph 3 talks about closing costs. So these are lender closing costs. We are not going to be putting any compensation being paid out of the buyer closing costs when we request seller to pay here. There is a maximum amount that's allowed for the buyer to accept. And keep in mind, VA buyers may not be able to pay costs as it is prohibited by law. There have been some changes because of the new compensation rules. So check with your lender before you ask for credits to be made to the buyer at closing and make sure your buyer is able to accept those. Now, the whole idea around this is delivering earnest money in order to earnestly attempt to purchase this property. So earnest money is going to be addressed in the financing contingency. In order to recover the earnest money, the buyer must, under the financing contingency, prove that the application was made before the deadline in paragraph 1, provide loan estimates And they need to have the delivery date to the buyer prior to the deadline of the application from paragraph 1. The buyer must have had all sufficient funds needed to close the sale, and the letter must contain the reason the buyer was denied for financing. Now, aside from the denial of financing, let's talk about the possibility of a low appraisal coming in. So what does it mean when a low appraisal comes in? And how long does the seller have to respond? How long does the buyer have to respond to the seller's response? And what happens if the buyer does nothing? Well, our financing contingency, again, does address this. So as we move along the financing contingency to paragraph 5, we will start talking about appraisals less than the sales price. The first part is the notice of low appraisal. Now, if an appraisal comes in less than the contract price, the buyer may, and they have a timeline within 3 days, give notice to the seller that this appraisal came in low. By doing this, the buyer is initiating a response from the seller. And our timelines for that response are laid out still in this 22A. Once that seller gets notice of the low appraisal, the seller actually has 10 days to deliver their response back. That 10 days is sometimes needed because one of the options, in fact, the first option here in paragraph 5BI, is a reappraisal or a reconsideration of value at the seller's expense by the same appraiser or another appraiser that's acceptable to the lender. Now, in this choice, the seller will ask the lender, or seller will ask the appraiser for a new appraisal of this and sometimes be able to provide other comparable properties to establish the value being a fair number. This is a process because we all know that appraisals aren't just a quick turnaround. So this process must be started immediately after receiving the notice if a seller receives that notice and they want to try to reappraisal. The second option a seller can do is consent to reduce that purchase price. Now, they can reduce that purchase price all the way down to what the appraisal came in at, or they can try to negotiate something in between. Now, if they choose to negotiate something in between, it is possible if that buyer has financing such as VA, USDA, or FHA, there might be an amendatory clause that does not obligate the buyer to purchase that property, even if they come to an agreement in the middle, unless the buyer chooses to do so. Now, the seller can also consent to reduce the purchase price down to exactly what the appraisal came in at. Or if a seller chooses to, the seller can just reject all the ideas of lowering the price at all and see if the buyer will be willing to come to the table with more money. This is the form that we're going to use to respond to a low appraisal. It's the 22AN, and you can see it's laid out very similarly to the inspection response form. It has your first section of your buyer's notice of low appraisal. Then 10 days later, the seller has to select something from this list of options. And then following the seller's reply, the buyer has 3 days to decide how they want to respond to the seller's response. Now, if you use the 22AN, remember that your response for this appraisal must be submitted within 3 days of receiving that. And a copy of the appraisal has to be attached to this. The seller has 10 days to respond with the options I'd noted. If you select option 1, the notice of reappraisal, keep in mind that this means the seller has already received back the reappraisal and it came in at the contract price. It was also approved by lender. Then the other options the seller has were listed in the 22A. The seller can consent to reduce the purchase price all the way down to the contract price or the appraisal price to match the contract price, or something in between, or the seller can just reject all ideas of lowering the price. Once the seller does that, the buyer must respond within 3 days. If the buyer does not respond, a non-response is considered a no and will automatically terminate this contract. Now, if the buyer chooses to terminate, should select the notice of termination. The notice of the waiver of financing is when a amount has been reached that the bank is willing to accept, and there is no more need or no more ability to fall back on a financing contingency because all of the items have been met to make that financing happen. There is nothing else that is contingent for this property to close. The acceptance of the reduced purchase price can be selected by the third option. And if the buyer has FHA, USDA, or VA, the buyer may choose the buyer's option, which leaves the amendatory clause still available if the buyer needs to fall back on that. Now, there may be times where a buyer doesn't want to give notice to a seller. Why would a buyer choose not to give notice? Or when would we have a buyer want to give notice? Well, typically, if you are only off by a couple $1,000s and the buyer says, you know what, I'll take care of it, you may want to hold off giving notice because once you give notice and you've come to an agreement, you're removing your financing contingency from being any sort of speed bump or roadblock for your future, and you're moving towards a close. If there's any insecurities about doing that, you may want to hold on to it just to make sure that you can truly close the sale. Why would a buyer want to give notice? Well, there have been situations where the appraised value has come in 75,000 plus less than a contract price. And when you have that much of a gap, it is possible that the buyer may just choose to negotiate this and see what happens. Now, the financing contingency, again, referencing back, remember, if any inaction is taken, so if any inaction is done, the buyer just chooses to not respond to this, it will automatically terminate the contract. It doesn't automatically push it forward to close as some of our other contingencies. So action must be taken. Make sure if you are working with a 22AN that your buyer is creating a response so you don't accidentally fall out of contract when that's not their intention. Now, it is possible that the appraisal could come in at value, but possibly have what they call an appraisal work order. This would be an example of a deck railing needing to be tightened or stairs needing to be replaced, or it could be something large or humongous. If an appraiser calls out conditions in order to appraise the home, it will be considered a work order. Now, it is not a requirement that a seller complete any work order, but it is not the buyer's fault if this work order can't be completed and it doesn't close. So that being said, if a work order comes up, the buyer has the option to submit the 22 AWO and request the seller do the work ordered by the appraiser. If the seller decides not to do that, then the buyer can walk away with their earnest money because the sale will not close. Remember, sellers must allow lenders to do their inspections as required with no limitation. A buyer is allowed to attend those lender-required inspections if they choose. And any work orders given by an appraiser shall be shared with the seller within 3 days from the appraisal. Any conditions protect the appraisal provision on the financing contingency as long as the appraisal provision is not waived. In the last part of our financing contingency, we do have the FHA, USDA, and VA appraisal certificate. We have the VA amendatory clauses. And what these both say is that it is basically up to the bank to determine the value of this property. According to paragraph 7, The buyer is not on the hook if that appraisal doesn't match the contract price. So including the 22A automatically consents the seller to complying with VA and FHA amendatory clauses and regulations. A lender may additionally require the verbiage to be signed again. If the verbiage is sent, it will state the same things that are included in paragraph 7. So you don't need to be concerned if you see these secondary amendatory clauses being sent from the bank. I wanted to talk about a few what-if scenarios. We'll talk about what happens if the buyer applies for financing late, the buyer gets denied, or interest rates go up. So I've bullet pointed these in sort of a Q&A style. So what happens if a buyer applies for financing late? This is after the 5 days if that was the default on your contract. Does the seller have any right to terminate? Well, no. The seller does not have the right to terminate because a buyer applied late. The consequence, though, is the waiver of that financing protection for the buyer. So the sellers just need to sit and wait it out, and the buyers better pull everything they have together to get it to close. What happens if a buyer gets denied? Does the buyer need to notify the seller? Well, there's no requirement that a buyer would need to notify the seller of a loan denial. The contingency will protect the buyer if they had applied as promised in the addendum. The buyer may give notice or continue to attempt to close the sale, but essentially they have the protection of their financing contingency because they did what they were supposed to, and in the meantime can still try everything else they can to get that sale closed without permission. What if the buyer's interest rate goes up and they no longer want to purchase? Well, the fact that the buyer's interest rate has changed does not excuse them from moving forward on financing. If they were approved, then they are not free to terminate just because they didn't like the rate. What if a buyer chooses to use cash instead of financing after they've already put a 22A in the offer? Well, the buyer may change their mind and use cash. The buyer must also, though, apply for financing that they agreed to if they want the continued protection of that contingency. If they don't want that protection, they can choose to use cash and waive the financing. The buyer has a pre-approval letter from lender A. Before the 5th day, after mutual acceptance, they switch to lender B. Does that buyer need consent? No, the buyer does not need consent because lenders can be switched before day 5, but not financing types. And what if the buyer applies for financing with a smaller down payment than the one on the 22A? Is the financing contingency waived or still intact? Well, it's waived. The buyer must follow the agreed promises that they made on the 22A to keep the protection of that contingency. There is a contingency termination form. If you find that your buyer is unable to obtain financing and you need to terminate because of that, we have a termination form, the 90I. That form needs to be filled out, and attached to that form should be a letter from the lender prepared to deliver with this notice. Do not send a rescission if the buyer has the right to terminate. Thank you for listening.